Well, hello. Thank you for coming to our June webinar. For folks joining us for the first time, Student Energy Club is a student-led organization focused on providing a platform for energy experts of today to educate the NC community on critical challenges that the energy system is facing, as well as emerging technologies being used to mitigate them. So if you're interested in being more involved, we are looking to expand our team and recruit officers interested in helping with events just like these. So if you're interested in energy issues, event planning, and engaging students on campus, you can go to our website at ncsuenergyclub.org and send an application in. The deadline is June 20th, but we are looking to extend it. So I'm now going to pass it up to Adi, who will introduce our speaker.
Awesome, thanks, Martina. So I'm really excited to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Meagan Kittle Autry. So Dr. Kittle Autry is a teaching assistant professor in the Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering Department, where she's also the Director of Graduate Professional Development. She holds a PhD in Technical Communication and teaches graduate courses in Engineering Research Communication and Technical Communication. From my own personal experience, I highly recommend enrolling in one of her courses. They're super helpful. So just some quick housekeeping logistics. There is a Q&A box in the Zoom webinar, but we encourage everyone to post in the chat window. So once you post in the chat, everyone, including the panelists and the attendees, can see what you've posted. Make sure you ask questions. We especially encourage the students to ask as many questions as you want. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Kittle Autry.
Thanks, Adi. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about how to communicate your science effectively with the public. So let's talk about our goals for today. I'm going to share with you some best practices in adapting your research to present it to the public and how to talk so that they will really listen. We'll talk about applying these strategies to a sample energy scenario and help you think about how you could apply them to your own work. And at the end, we've got time for questions, especially on any topics we don't have time to cover today. Today's topic is really an entire course worth, so we're not going to cover everything, but if there's a particular area you're interested in, such as delivery of a talk, but we don't have time to cover that today, please definitely ask it in the Q&A. So let's get started. So to begin with today, we're going to discuss some important strategies for how you discuss your research with the public, help them to understand what's really important, and maybe even act and create change in their lifestyles because of what you're sharing with them. So the first and most important strategy that we're going to talk about today is to help you shift your thinking in preparing a talk to understanding how it's all about the audience. A speech is like a bridge. You are standing on one side of the river with your knowledge that you have, and the audience is standing on the other side without it. It's not their job to jump across and meet you where you're at, but instead it's your job to think about how you can best discuss, present, share your ideas to help them get to where you're at. You need to build that bridge. And to do that, you have to shift your focus from thinking about what you know to thinking about what your audience knows, along with a lot of other factors about them. You basically need to use the cliche, step into their shoes and see where they're coming from. So we start every successful communication situation with what we call audience analysis. So this looks like asking yourself a whole bunch of questions about the potential people to whom you're talking. You'd start with, well, who will be there? What do they know about your topic? And of course, the parallel, what don't they know? What values do they have? Where would they agree with you on what you're saying, and where might they disagree with you so that you can prepare counter arguments? What is it that they're expecting to get out of your presentation? Are there stories and examples or narratives or props that would most speak to these people? Are they going to use this information after the talk? What do you want them to get out of it? What's that takeaway message that you want them to leave with? Is it they need to change their behavior? They need to care more about this topic? They need to teach their children something? What is it? And really importantly, you need to hone in on this idea of why they will care about what you have to say to them. So let's take an example from civil engineering. Let's say that you live in a city where they're going to create a bike lane downtown. They have to close a road for a whole year in order to create this bike lane and do the construction. If you're going to a city council meeting to present to them, to present to the public about this bike lane construction, you'd want to think about all the different audiences who might be there and why they would be there and what they would care about talking about. So for example, with the bike lane construction example, you might have business owners on that street downtown who are going to care about the road being closed because they'll probably see a decrease in business, and they might need to think about how to still attract pedestrian business to their stores so they don't go out of business. For people who live in a neighborhood adjacent, they might be concerned about how much increased traffic will go through their neighborhood and how to keep their kids safe. For cyclists, they might care a lot about how quickly it'll be done and how it will connect to other bike lanes on the adjoining streets. For city planners, they want to know about how much it'll cost, how long it will take, and how it might impact the infrastructure surrounding it. So this is just a really brief example to show you that in every communication situation, there are different audiences who care about different things, and you'll need to prepare what you're saying to address them all separately. So let's do a quick thought experiment, and I want you to put your suggestions in the chat. Make sure it says to panelists and attendees. Let's say you were invited as an expert to come and talk to a community who would be potentially getting a wind farm in the area. Could you put in the chat who one potential audience might be at that meeting and what thing they might care about or what they might most want to know in attending that meeting? All right, great. So we've got our first suggestion here, farmers. What are farmers going to care about? All right, great. Land use, absolutely, right? Okay, environmentalists will be one group. Yeah, and what are the things that they might care about? You might have some of them thinking about, oh, great, we're bringing clean energy. But then you might have some of them who say, but wait, what about the birds, right? That's something people say about wind farms. So when you think about that audience, for example, right, you'll know that, okay, if I'm going to talk to farmers, they might care about, can they still grow crops on their land and make money? If they're trying to sell their land later on, might this increase or decrease their value, their land value? For environmentalists, they might want to know, how much might this increase our grids, our, local usage of renewable energy? But what happens to the birds? Well, you could then prepare a counter argument where you would be able to tell them confidently, did you know that domestic cats are a much greater threat to birds annually than wind farms are? Domestic cats kill between 1 and 4 billion birds a year in the United States, according to a recent study. But wind farms to date have only kill an estimated 300 to 400,000 birds per year. So by thinking through ahead of time who your audiences might be and what they care about, you're able to tailor your content to reach these different audiences and help them to hear what you have to say, trust you as an informed expert, and also just really listen to your message because you are talking to each of them and thinking you've thought through their sets of concerns. So audience analysis is a critical way to start preparing your communication. All right, I want to look at a quick example of someone who did a talk about energy, behavior, and lowering your energy bill. At the end of this, I want you to share in the chat, what are the strategies he used in his talk to make what he had to say accessible, interesting, or relevant to the people in the audience?
Yeah, I can't hear.
Okay. Is it possible maybe that the settings aren't set on sharing audio with the screen potentially? Maybe, hey, Adi, would you please just maybe pause the recording and I'll reshare my screen. Okay. All right, here we go. Please let me know ASAP if you don't hear it.
This is coal, most common source of electricity on the planet. And there's enough energy in this coal to light this bulb for more than a year. But unfortunately, between here and here, most of that energy is lost to things like transmission leakage and heat. In fact, only 10% ends up as light. So this coal will last a little bit more than a month. If you wanted to light this bulb for a year, you'd need this much coal. The bad news here is that for every unit of energy we use, we waste 9. That means there's good news, because for every unit of energy we save the other 9. So the question is, how can we get the people in this room and across the globe to start paying attention to the energy we're using and start wasting less of it? The answer comes from a behavioral science experiment that was run one hot summer 10 years ago and only 90 miles from here in San Marcos, California. Graduate students put signs on every door in a neighborhood asking people to turn off their air conditioning and turn on their fans. 1/4 of the homes received a message that said, "Did you know you could save $54 a month this summer? Turn off your air conditioning, turn on your fans." Another group got an environmental message, and still a third group got a message about being good citizens, preventing blackouts. Most people guess that money-saving message worked best of all. In fact, none of these messages worked. They had 0 impact on energy consumption. It was as if the grad students hadn't shown up at all. But there was a fourth message. And this message simply said, when surveyed, 77% of your neighbors said that they turn off their air conditioning and turn on their fans. Please join them, turn off your air conditioning and turn on your fans. And wouldn't you know it, they did. The people who received this message showed a marked decrease in energy consumption simply by being told what their neighbors were doing. So what does this tell us? Well, if something is inconvenient, even if we believe in it, moral suasion, financial incentives don't do much to move us. But social pressure, that's powerful stuff.
Okay.
This is coal.
All right. So this is a brief clip from his TED Talk. So I'd like to hear from you in the chat. Let me know, what are the strategies he was using in this segment of his talk that was making his topic interesting and accessible for this general audience? Great. He showed rather than just telling. Awesome. So a great example of that was the coal, right? I bet the average person has no idea how much coal it takes to power a light bulb for a year. So you got to see that in person. It's really quite striking. You think of all the coal that has to be dug up just for that one light bulb. Great. What else? The comparison. Okay, good, right? So comparing, right, the light bulb and the coal and just showing how that was working. Absolutely. Okay, not much jargon. Excellent, right? While he was recounting a study, he didn't dive into the methods and maybe what the p-value was of the behavioral analysis. He gave them what really mattered, right? The fact that the most effective message was social pressure. Great. So whole number statistics. Yes, focusing on good, clear numbers that people can walk away with, right? We only 10% of the coal actually powers the light bulb. We lose the 90% of it. Those are easy things for people to remember. And in this case, they were powerful. So he used it. You really think, gosh, it is so wasteful to only use that 10%. Any other ideas? Yeah, real world story, right? He personalized the study. When you write the methods section of a research article, do you describe it the way that he did? Graduate students went door to door and gave people messages? No, it would sound very different from that. But he adapted, he translated from research, academic research publication language into a talk for a general public language and told the story of, the graduate students' research project and saying, hey, the first 3 messages, it was as if they didn't even show up, right? It didn't even make a difference on those people's behaviors, right? So he was really making that story very interesting. There was a little bit of that humor too, right? When he put the visual on the screen, the last one, emphasizing the fact that your neighbors did better, right? There's a little bit of that humor there. The visual is nice and clean and clear, no cluttered slides, just the key message for people to sort of reinforce what he was saying, but the focus was really on him as a speaker. So in this really short clip of just about a minute or so, there were a lot of really great strategies that he used. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these strategies throughout the rest of our time together today. Okay, so the next thing you need to think about after you've analyzed your audience and why they would be there, why they would care, what's going to connect with them, what information you need to make sure to share for that particular, group in the audience, is the focus on the main message. A research talk or publication can be complex, it can be complicated, it can have multiple interwoven narratives to arrive at your conclusion. But when you're talking to the public, you need to have a clear, concise message that's obvious that they leave with, right? There needs to be that one key idea. So I want you to brainstorm right now. I want you to just take about 15 seconds to think about, if I were taking my current research project and I needed to describe this to somebody, maybe just, first-year students in our department who might be interested in joining your lab, what would you tell them? What would be the main message you'd want to share as the takeaway? And think about the difference between, social pressure is a good way to help people change their electrical consumption habits versus the results of a behavioral analysis demonstrate that the most effective messaging was that of social pressure, right? There's a key difference there. So take a few seconds to just think about, what would be this main message that I would be communicating about my work, and how could I write this in one sentence that would be clear for incoming first-year students? And if you're confident or if you want to give it a try, feel free to share it in the chat. All right, so we've had about 15 seconds. I think this is harder than you think, right? To take all of your complex research, all of the things you're doing every day for your work, and distilling it in a way to make it accessible to the public. Your main idea probably has many iterations, right? So let's think about how to best approach this. A good talk from its initial research undergoes a transformation in order to be appropriate for the public or a more general non-expert audience. There are many different kinds of audiences we could potentially have. So let's look at an example. Let's take an original research idea and see how it was adapted for a general audience. So this graduate student began with the idea, nano indentation analysis of cement demonstrates changes in calcium silica hydrates from exposure to magnesium sulfate. Most people at any TED Talk would not know what that means, but it's a super important line of research. However, if you're going to go and tell other people about what you're doing, you're really shifting the focus of what you're talking about for those people. So here's how Francisco adapted the core message so that the public could understand what he was doing. By studying cement composition at a nanoscale, we explore if we can replace seawater with fresh water when making cement and save millions of gallons of drinking water per year. So what did he do here? How did he go from the research idea to this message for the public? A few strategies. Number one, he cut the jargon, right? If you're thinking about your audience and talking to an audience in the language that they will understand, you're going to have to cut the jargon that we are very comfortable with in our research area and focus on terms that are more accessible to the public. You also want to think about cutting words that are potentially confusing to the public. For example, the word aerosol in research means something different than what the public might understand aerosol to mean, difference between particles and spray cans. So focus on each word to make sure that it is accessible to the public and not confusing or potentially getting muddied with, something similar in the public. Another strategy here is that instead of focusing on the methods, like what the original research idea stated, the focus is on the goal, right? A lot of times the public really, they don't care about exactly how you did the work, but they're focused on, what the intended outcome is. Why are you doing it? Well, we're doing this research to see if we can replace fresh water with seawater when making cement, right? Because it's currently made with fresh water, and we want to be able to use seawater in order to save drinking water. And then finally, he adds this, so what? The public wants to know why it matters. In our research area, we use introduction sections and extensive literature reviews to argue for the importance and novelty of our research. But we don't use those kinds of structures when we're talking to the public. Instead, we have to think about why they would care. This goes back to our audience analysis. Why would somebody care that we're trying to use ocean water in cement instead of fresh water? Well, probably because drinking water is a finite resource. So by connecting to that value of saving drinking water, you're helping them to understand why your research matters, or he is helping them understand. So when you think about your main message and you've thought about your audience and the best ways to approach connecting with them and addressing their concerns and values in your work, you have to start thinking about how you structure your talk and what content goes in there. A key difference when you're talking to a public audience is that the entire way that you organize what you say is sort of thrown on its head from how we traditionally communicate in research. If you've ever taken a class with me, we talk a lot about the IMRAD structure of research articles, where you start with your introduction, with the literature review, methods, results, and discussion. But the public can't wait for the discussion section of your talk to really find out what matters about your research. They want to know the bluff, the bottom line up front. So when you're giving a talk to the public, you want to open your talk by telling them right away what your main point is and why it matters. Bonus points to you if you're able to open your talk in such a way that it really hooks them in and grabs their attention by using opening lines like, today you will learn something that will add 10 years to your life. That's an opening line from a TED Talk about playing video games, of all things. Or, did you know more people have access to a mobile phone than a toilet? That would probably shock a lot of people. We take for granted in the Western world that we have a toilet to use in our house, maybe even more than one. So the idea that not everybody in the world lacks access to a toilet, or not everybody in the world has access to a toilet, would probably grab their attention and make them want to listen to what you're about to tell them. So remember, when you're opening your talk and thinking about how to discuss that first part with your audience, you need to hit them with the payoff right away. Why should they listen to this talk? Why should they listen to you for 5, 10, 30 minutes? You want to give them the bottom line up front. This is an important way to approach talking with the public because as a different kind of audience than our research audience, they have different values and things that they're looking for in what you're saying. And this is the idea of putting yourself in their shoes when you're giving a talk. Researchers want to know the origins of our work. They want to see us work hard to justify why it matters and where it fits in with existing literature. But the audience, the general public, doesn't have that same kind of values or background knowledge or want us to jump through hoops to have to communicate with them. They really want to know, why should they care? So if you focus on putting that content in upfront, you're going to catch their attention, hook them in, and get them committed to listening to you throughout your talk. You can weave it in kind of all throughout. That's really what the public wants to see in a a talk that an expert's going to come to give them. They want to know how what you're saying works into this bigger picture, maybe what needs to change in their behavior, or what else that they need to know to improve their lives. An important part of making this argument to the public is tapping into their emotions. So convincing arguments incorporate a few different components of messaging. In the research world, we are really focused on 2 of these 3 message components. So we focus a lot on logos, or the logic and evidence of our arguments, and then ethos, or the credibility of the person giving that message, right? So we put our PhD credentials after our name, or our MA, or describe all the years we've been working in research to justify that we're experts. But the third part of a convincing argument, pathos, is often left out of research communication, but it is essential for talking to the public. Emotional appeals can take on many forms, and it's not just about making people cry at the thought that there's not going to be a planet around for our grandchildren, but it's about thinking about the best ways to incorporate the emotions that might be relevant to your particular topic. They play a role. And we also have learned some important things about emotional messaging in talking with the public about science over this past year with the pandemic. For example, we do know that fear is a motivator and a factor in helping the public to maybe listen to a message about changing behavior in science. But we also know that the emotion of hope can be more powerful at gathering support for behavior change than fear. People need to see that the changes they make are going to make a difference, right? It's the same reason that it's hard to convince people to vote. They think, oh, my one vote doesn't matter. But if you give them a story of, a personal reason why you're engaged in this work, or why it's important to vote, and why voting, if everybody decides to come out and vote, not just you, it can really make a difference. If you give a hopeful spin on it, then you start to convince people to get out to vote. Same thing with the kinds of messages you might be telling them about their energy use or supporting different policy changes in their community. You can also connect to the emotions of an audience by sharing a personal story about why you're engaged in your research, what sparked your interest, or if you have a personal connection to the research, the way that a lot of PFAS researchers do, right? They learned that the water in their hometown was contaminated, so they began doing this research in how to remove these forever chemicals from our water. When you humanize yourself, that also draws out emotions in people, and it helps the audience to just better connect to you as a speaker. So another strategy is to not be afraid to tell a story. It is a super opener. If you've ever watched a few TED Talks, you know that 9 out of 10 of them start with a story. Sometimes a funny one too. That's like a super bonus. So it's okay to tell them some information like, why are you pursuing this field? Helps people see that you do science for a noble cause. Or is there potentially a memorable childhood event that links you to the project? Or if you don't like talking about yourself, is there a character in your research that you could tell a story about? For example, with Alex Lasky, he was telling the story of his grad students and the way that they were, going out and putting these signs on the doors. So they were a character in his story that he was telling. So a takeaway here is that by telling a story about your work, or using a story to communicate your main message, you're actually tapping into a structure that we as humans are hardwired to remember better. Because back before we had written communication as humans, we had oral communication, and people passed down their learning by telling stories. So it is a way that we do remember information better. So tell a story. Another important way to communicate your research with the public is to use metaphors and analogies. So these are an important way to help kind of build that bridge, right? From something that they already know to help them get to the point of the thing that they don't know. So metaphors and analogies work by comparing the unknown to something that is familiar. So we've got a couple of examples here on the screen, right? The idea that executive functioning in our brain is kind of like air traffic control, or a pixel is like a tile in a mosaic, and so on and so forth. So when you make a comparison to the unknown with something that is known, you're helping people to make those connections and remember them, and also helping people to be able to tell them to other people later on. Don't forget that visuals, that metaphors and analogies can also be visual. So that's what Alex Lasky did with the amount of coal that was used there. And then as well as here, we've got some analogies of the size of planets relative to one another with fruit and vegetables. Right? So visuals can also be really effective. We live in a visual world now, so by using these types of strategies, you're going to help your audience to better remember and understand what you are saying. Finally, when you're adapting your work for the public, you want to also put numbers in context. So a couple of you latched on to the statistics that Mr. Lasky was providing. The 10% is used, 90% is lost. And these numbers are memorable. Sometimes you have numbers that are really out of scale or that people wouldn't, intuitively understand with the, technical or statistical knowledge that they have. So help them put it into context with something memorable, like making polyester requires TPA. And in 2006, we made about 60 billion pounds of TPA worldwide. That's the same weight as 82 Empire State Buildings. That helps people to better understand the kind of mind-blowing scale of how much of that was made just to produce fabric, right? That's quite a lot. So for example, we've got it takes one wheelbarrow full of coal to light just one light bulb for an entire year. So that was a number put into context. And then the bonus, of course, was that you actually had that wheelbarrow full right there to see and kind of be stunned by. So put numbers into context. Here's a great example from a TED Talk.
The sun continuously radiates about 173 quadrillion watts of solar energy at the Earth, which is almost 10,000 times our present needs. It's been estimated that a surface that spans several 100,000 kilometers would be needed to power humanity at our present usage.
All right, so they've got a few big numbers here, and then they've used different scales and imagery to help you to see that sort of context for how big the sun's energy and how much solar power space you would need to actually do that. So let's summarize some of these key ideas that we've covered here. We've talked about picking one main message. We don't want complex narratives that incorporate too many different threads, even though that's how you might write about your research. We do this audience analysis, and we understand that our audiences are not mutually exclusive, but someone who's a resident could also be a business owner, could also be on city council, could also have a kid, right? There are lots of reasons why audiences would care about what you have to say. And you want to think carefully about the strategies that best reach them. And then you want to make sure you're adapting your science using things like comparisons, context, images, and stories. So the one last thing I want to leave you with is to not only focus on the words that you're going to say, but the reality is most of us give presentations these days with slides to accompany us. So don't forget about your slides. And here's a few key tips to help you design slides that are going to be excellent visual supports, but not a crutch or a script. So the key points here is that anytime you're putting up a slide, when you're giving a scientific talk to the public, is you need to keep the design simple. There's a good rule of thumb where one slide should give just one idea. Less is more when it comes to putting content on a slide. There's no rule about how many slides you should have for how long your talk is. If you've ever heard the phrase, if you have 10 minutes to talk, you should have 10 slides or 1 minute per slide, that is garbage. You should have one slide for each key idea you're trying to present to your audience. And your whole idea isn't going to be on your slide. You're going to have a visual that supports what you're saying, but then you're going to know your talk well enough that the slides don't have to be a script, but the slide supports you, and then you become the focus of the talk because the slide doesn't have all that content on it. You want to keep everything simple in terms of color scheme, focus, and pick just a couple of key colors that you use throughout the presentation, maybe something that's connected to your area of work, like the color green, if you're talking about renewable energy. To stick with the contemporary look that's nice and clean, use sans serif fonts like the one I've got an example of here on the screen. Now, if you're going to use visuals, you want to stick to one large, preferably striking image per slide. 4 or 5 graphs on a slide is not going to clearly communicate an idea to a public audience. In fact, it's probably going to confuse them. Most members of the general public don't have the kind of statistical literacy needed to read a box and whisker plot. So don't put it on there. I'm going to tell you what to do in a couple more slides after this one. Also, ditch the bulleted list. We're all bulleted out, you know, bullets kill. So don't kill your talk. Instead, you could try a strategy like a hidden table or table with transparent borders to line up text neatly, like I've done here, without having to put bullets on there. And finally, use the rule of thirds when you're laying out your slide. So if you're going to have more than just, you know, a single striking image, think about dividing your slide up into thirds vertically and horizontally. I've used this principle here. On the first 1/3 horizontally, you've got the picture of the power, tower. And then on the second 2/3, I've got where my text is. And then on the top third, I've got the title, keep design simple. And then the bottom 2/3, I have the body text that I want you all to be taking away. So use the rule of thirds because threes are more pleasing to our human eye than just halves, although halves can work too, but definitely not quarters. So let's look at an example. This was a slide that was originally designed for someone who wanted to talk to the public about what WASH programs were. So this was the original draft of the things that the person wanted to say, and all of the points were made here on the slide. This violates a few of the different rules we just talked about, right? It's not simple, it's not clean, there's way too many ideas going on here. So we went through a few iterations of revising in order to make this a slide that would be more appropriate to the public. So here's our next iteration. Still kind of text heavy, but we improved a few things. What's better about this slide? If you have some ideas about what's better, maybe put it in the chat. Great, emphasize statistics. Use of italics, absolutely. Yeah, so let's focus on quickly the statistics portion. Numbers are memorable for people. They also feel official and real, truthful. So make your numbers emphasized. Here I did that by making them bold and the corresponding color. All right, so an eye-catching figure, great. Oh, good, I love all these answers coming in. All right, eye-catching figure. This communicates the idea, right? If you're saying what's WASH and you'd never had any idea what WASH was before, you might not know what it was after this slide, right? But if I tell you WASH programs, you might start to guess that it has something to do with clean water, given the visual that's chosen, right? And it's very memorable. It immediately also brings back a few emotional ideas about children and third world countries or global south countries and their access to clean water, which we know, historically has not been very good, right? So rule of thirds, absolutely. So I've got the image on 2/3, the text on 1/3, the title in the top third, the body text. Yes, the why should I care is here, right? Great. It defines safely managed, right? So there's lots of things that are better about this slide. So if you designed a slide like this for public talk, I think this would be great. It also ditched the bullets, right? So we just went with the table with the transparent borders. But even better, I think, might be something like this, where you're focused entirely on this visual that has the emotional appeal in there because of the nature of this particular topic, right? As a Syrian refugee, actually, and the water that he has access to. And what it does is it pulls the main idea. If you are going to have a 2-minute section of your talk where you discuss what is a WASH program, water and sanitary and hygiene program, and you are going to tell people what it was, why it was important, and what your goals were, a way you might effectively communicate on a slide the key idea is the fact that these programs exist because only 71% of the world has access to safely managed water. So you can see here the transition from an initial draft or how we maybe present our research when we're in an academic setting or like a classroom or a conference setting, and how you would eventually transition this to a point where you have a striking slide that the public would really connect to and understand from. Of course, the burden then is on you as the speaker to have that, thorough knowledge of what it is that you're saying. But that is your job, right? The focus is supposed to be on you, and slides have always been meant to be a support and not the script. And over time, we've definitely gotten away from that. So a couple of other ways to help you design slides that are going to be attractive and compelling for your audience is to have that really tight color palette and use technology to help you generate a great one. Let's say you've got a key image for your research, such as this image of a dam. You can upload this to a palette generating website, and it will tell you what the key colors are. And then you can use, it'll give you, the codes, the RBG, CMYK codes, so that you can then go and just change the colors in your slide program in order to make everything really nicely aligned. But here's an example again of using striking image, 2/3, 1/3, large text, one main point on a slide. And then in terms of our statistics, so I told you we'd come back to an idea about, really ditching graphs that require statistical literacy in favor of focusing a slide on a single big takeaway idea. So, because members of the public are not going to be able to read a lot of your graphs as well as your academic audience, in a lot of cases, it's a good idea to switch in instead these bands. They're lovingly called bands in the statistical community, which is short for big ass numbers. And the reason why we use them is that they're memorable, they're easy to read, and then they switch the focus back to you as a speaker. But this is a really clear slide. 4 in 10 bridges in the United States are more than 50 years old. So the key statistics here are nice and large. I've used these icons to help to sort of balance the slide and then also sort of hammer home the message of 4 in 10 of the bridges, right? So here's an example of doing that. Pick your key color, make it nice and large. Don't be afraid to go big, especially if we're still giving Zoom talks for a while into the future. Remember, people's screens might not be that large, so you want to make things nice and big so people can see them. Before we close and switch to Q&A, I just wanted to leave you with a list of slide resources. So everything I used today for my presentation, and I tried out a few different things to just show you what all the possibilities would be. Everything here is open access, Creative Commons licensed. So you can go to these websites and go to these databases to use the images or icons, and they're free for your use. For any of the kinds of presentations that you might be doing. Like I said, our world is visual, right? Instagram is the fastest growing social media site along with, TikTok, because they're visual, right? So we're moving away from lots of text. And so use these visuals that really draw your listener in, and then let them focus on what you're saying because you've carefully crafted your message with the strategies that we've used before. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for coming today. I'm so pleased to be invited by the Student Energy Club, and I welcome any questions you might have, clarification, or anything like that.
Thanks, Dr. K. This was super helpful webinar. For folks, you guys can drop your questions in the chat window. Let me kick off the Q&A with a question of my own. So these are super practical and sort of implementable tips that we can use for our talks with the public. I know we have many graduate students in our audience today. What are some of the ways we can actually practice this? Like what are the avenues and channels we can actually use? Because often we don't have the sort of like the public audience that we can present our research to. Often it's a more specialized audience. And I think it's really important in terms of even getting a better perspective on our research when we communicate it with the public. So what are some of the platforms that we can use to actually implement these?
That is a great question. So one I immediately can think of is the 3-minute thesis competition, which at NC State is open to both doctoral students and master students. And while that has some kind of artificial constraints that you wouldn't face necessarily if you were truly giving a talk in the public, it forces you to do all of that thinking about your messaging, your story, adapting your, what you know, putting numbers into context. So you go through that practice. And what I think students who do that competition find is that they understand their research a lot better after they've had to articulate why it matters and who should care. So that's one avenue I encourage everybody to do. Plus, you can win money. So I think it's great that the school does it. A lot of departments do it, and like for example in civil we do it. But if you're not in civil, a lot of the departments or colleges do it, and then of course at the school level. In Raleigh, the Museum of Natural Sciences hosts Globe Talks. I don't know if they've restarted now post-pandemic. Well, we're not really post-pandemic. I'm not sure when they will restart, but usually once a year they have researchers from the area, Triangle area universities, or even some companies like RTI. They will come in and give brief talks, like 5 to 7 minutes long, about their work in design for the public. And you speak in the big 2-story globe in the museum. So that's a place that you could take a look and see for an opportunity to do that. Also, any kind of outreach that your PI might be obligated to do as a part of having an NSF grant. You could ask your PI what their public outreach requirements are and see, could you go and do a lesson in a high school chemistry class one day, or a middle school science class? Pretty much every NSF grant has public outreach requirements. And if you designed a lesson or connected with a teacher at one of those schools, or a principal or vice principal, that's also a really good opportunity. And that will really force you to have a really good message if you're talking to like 8th graders. So those are some ideas I can think of off the top of my head. If anybody else knows of some, please feel free to add them in the chat. Yeah, Toastmasters, absolutely. So for those of you who might not be familiar with Toastmasters as like an American club, it's like a social club you can join to improve your public speaking skills. And you give a talk about just whatever your sort of preferred choices are, and you listen to people, give them feedback, and you also practice. They do have competitions you could enter as well. And there are a lot of different Toastmasters variations around the Triangle area you could join. Yes. Other questions?
I have another question, I guess.
Sure. Yeah.
So could you speak a little more about like one thing that came to my mind was even social media like Twitter, especially in the energy community. The energy community has a very vibrant presence on Twitter. Like Energy Twitter is like, I often see like professors post threads on their papers, and it's a very nice way to sort of condense the message of your research paper. Is that something you would recommend, or how would you recommend approaching it? Minus the toxicity of Twitter, but just like for like the research aspect of Twitter, like is that something you would recommend?
Yeah. So full disclosure, I do use Twitter, but more just to sort of read and know what's going on at the moment. I don't have as much exciting things for me to tweet about. But the reason I would say to try out on Twitter is that if you aren't talking about what you're doing, no one else is going to be talking about you for yourself. So it's a really good way to practice condensing your message, thinking of what the narrative is, right? When people develop threads, they don't just like tweet and post, but you really should write out a thread and think about the progression of the ideas. And so it forces you to condense your ideas. But research does show that papers that are tweeted about end up being cited more than papers that are never exposed on social media. So there's definitely some kind of connection, correlation, not necessarily causation, but there's definitely some correlation between, you know, tweeting it and the increased visibility and the reach that you can have within your research community. So I definitely advocate for that. It's also a good way for people to learn about what you do and end up connecting with you for job opportunities. I've met a lot of people, gotten a lot of clients over the years by using Twitter and tweeting about what I do. So I would definitely advocate practicing accessible versions of your work on Twitter.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I would say to like, don't be afraid of the public, right? There, in the public, there's not one single public either, you know, but we all sort of need to be in this together. You all are addressing really important research issues that we need buy-in for or to invest money in. So we need to get comfortable with talking outside of academia and reaching more audiences. And we can't do it by speaking our language we speak to each other, but we really have to walk in their shoes and understand their values in order to, you know, have messages that connect with them. So this should just be a tool you have in your toolbox that you can use as basically a knowledge worker, right, in the 21st century. I think that's an essential tool for any kind of knowledge worker, because you always have to be able to reach across your discipline to connect with other, you know, different types of people with no matter what kind of work you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one example I can think of is the way my extended family in India kept in touch is like we used to do like bi-weekly Zoom calls. And on one of those calls, I actually presented on like climate change and the impacts of climate change in India. And when we asked people to sort of think of strategies, we had the older generation who spoke about like solar cookers, and they spoke about the urbanization they've seen through their decades. So it's often everyone has an example that they could relate to, and so yeah, that's really good advice. Are there any
That's
more
cool.
questions? We have one question
Yep.
right now in the chat.
Yep. Do you have suggestions on how to evaluate the ability? So evaluate your own scientific communication skills. Is that what you're asking, Chin? Yes. Great question. I would say, you know, well, here's the thing. If you're in my department, you can reach out to me, right? And we can work on that together. So don't be afraid to do that. And then find the other resources that exist at the university, right? So everybody has access to the graduate school. You can connect with the people in the graduate school and ask them for appointments and advice and strategies for developing a talk. That's a service that exists, right? So while you're at NC State and a part of this thriving community, use those different kinds of resources. Maybe your lab has, you know, journal club or something on Fridays, or asks you to do presentations. You could always ask your PI about, hey, for our next series of presentations, could we instead approach it by like how we would tell our research to non-academics, right? That's an important skill that I think a lot of PIs acknowledge now. So you could always propose that for your labs, like next series of group meetings. So there are different ways you could start to do that. I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Yeah. And I would just say practice, right? You know, like none of us get it right the first time around. I don't want to tell you how many hours I spent on these slides, and I've given this talk for a few years in my class, but I thought I have a different audience. I have students directly interested in this energy, so I need to adapt what I'm doing to meet their needs and focus on the concerns they might have or the topics that they're discussing. So I completely rearranged it and redid the slides, even though it's building from a base of knowledge. I think that's one thing people don't recognize always, is you can't just pick up a presentation and like take it to a different place and a different audience. You have to always be adapting it, but the more you practice, you know, the easier it becomes and the better you get. But every time you have to start fresh by thinking about your audience.
That's a good point. Are there any other questions? I know we're nearing our time here. You did a great job explaining basically everything throughout your presentation. So, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. But yeah. All right, then. That's all the time we have for this webinar then. Again, thank you so much, Dr. K, for presenting this fascinating talk. I personally think it's incredibly important because no matter how important our research might be, it won't have the impact we're looking for if we can't communicate it properly to a general audience. So, but I also want to thank everyone else for attending. And again, if you would like to learn more about our organization, or if you're interested in becoming an officer, please visit our website at ncisuenergyclub.org. But other than that, thanks for coming and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
See you
you.
guys.